Alright, well, with Resident Evil 3 Remake coming out in early 2020, there's no better time than now for me to review the OG Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation. After all, it's one of my favorite games, and certainly my most favorite of the Resident Evil series. So by now, I'm sure everybody on the internet knows that a remake of Resident Evil 3 is set to come out in March 2020, and like most of you out there, I am beyond hyped. I'll get this out of the way from the get-go. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is my absolute favorite game in the RE series. It was the third Resident Evil game that I had played after Resident Evil 2 and then Resident Evil 1, and having played all of the other mainline titles, afterwards, I was left feeling disappointed with some and very satisfied with others. Yet now, in December 2019, I still find myself replaying the original Resident Evil 3 more than any of the other games in the series. Now, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is one of the more popular entries, and it is rare that I encounter a Resident Evil fan who hated the game, unlike, say, an RE fan who hated Resident Evil 6, which is quite common. But it's rare that someone tells me it's their favorite game in the series. No, it's usually Resident Evil 2 that holds that honor, or sometimes Resident Evil Remake, and a very, very small minority of people who say Code Veronica. But I'm here to tell you the reason why Resident Evil 3 is my favorite of the Resident Evil titles, and why, in my opinion at least, it is still the best Resident Evil game to date. I figure this is the perfect time, just because the trailer was recently released. It's repeated often across the internet that Resident Evil 3 was always intended to be a side story, and Code Veronica was intended to be Resident Evil 3 before getting switched to Code Veronica for the next generation consoles at the time, and Resident Evil 3 was promoted. That's actually a misconception that's just been spreading around, and I'm going to read an excerpt from Resident Evil 3's scenario writer Yasuhisa Kawamura, and he tells the story as to how Resident Evil 3 became Resident Evil 3, and I'll provide a link in the description below so you can read this for yourself. So the interviewer says, "Flagship was known for handling the scenarios in the Resident Evil series at the time. Was there a particular reason you, Yasuhisa Kawamura, were chosen to write Biohazard 3? And Kawamura responds, "In 1998, Flagship's lead scenario writer Nobuo Sugimura was busy working on Biohazard Code Veronica, and other Flagship scenario writers already had their hands full working on Resident Evil 0. Director Hideki Kamiya's team was already working on the next title in the series, Resident Evil 3. The game was loosely set on a luxury cruise liner and had a general plot where Hunk was attempting to bring back a sample of the G virus. I was assigned to a newly formed team that was working on a spin-off title called Biohazard Gaiden. Gaiden is Japanese for side story or spin-off. In this instance, Gaiden was the initial name for Last Escape. It is not referring to the Game Boy Color game of the same name. Last Escape being Nemesis. The director of Gaiden was Kazuhiro Aoyama, a game designer who is responsible for designing the levels in Resident Evil 1 and 2. The rest of the members, with the exception of the programmers and sound crew, were comprised of newly hired staff. In place of Flagship, I was chosen to write the scenario and assist Mr. Aoyama in designing the game. Gaiden was intended to be a small-scale game made in a short time span, so even though I was new to the company, it was deemed that I would be capable of handling the scenario. However, things started to change mid-1998 when we received word about the impending transition to the PlayStation 2. Mr. Kamiya's team was working hard building a top-quality game, but alas, it was targeted for the PlayStation 1. By the time the game launched, the market would have shifted toward the PlayStation 2. Furthermore, the PlayStation 2 was a powerful system, and without sufficient time for development, the Resident Evil quality that everyone expected would not be achievable. Forced to make a change in plans, Yoshiki Okamoto, who was general manager of development at the time, announced that Resident Evil Gaiden was going to become the last numbered release in the Resident Evil series for the PlayStation 1. What this meant was from that moment on, Gaiden was no longer just a side story, but a part of the official plotline. Code Veronica was a Dreamcast exclusive game. The scenario for Zero was just getting started, and Mr. Kamiya's team was forced to go back to the drawing board to design for the PlayStation 2. This meant that fans on the PlayStation would have to wait several years for the next sequel, a scenario that Capcom wanted to avoid. On the other hand, it would have been unacceptable for a game designed by Mr. Kamiya to be any less than perfect in quality, and besides, it would be unthinkable to rush the development on a brand new hardware like the PlayStation 2. So the decision was made to promote the Gaiden team into the new Resident Evil 3 team, and the staff size was significantly increased to work toward a launch on the PlayStation 1. This allowed us to release a Resident Evil game on a consistent schedule, while providing Mr. Kamiya's team enough time to concentrate on the capabilities of the new platform. Mr. Kamiya's team was reorganized into the Resident Evil 4 team, and was tasked with creating a top-notch game for the PlayStation 2. When Resident Evil 3 was finished, a large portion of that team, including myself, joined in to help. This Resident Evil 4 project eventually changed directions and finally saw completion as the game Devil May Cry. Now, with the sudden promotion of the Gaiden game, I was forced to expand the scale of the content. The story was initially supposed to just be an escape chronicle from an infected Raccoon City, but after discussions with the producer and director, it was decided that instead of introducing a new character, Jill Valentine will play the role of the main character. It was also decided that Raccoon City would be wiped from existence. You can say that in a sense, the launch of the PlayStation 2 ended up taking the lives of 100,000 Raccoon City citizens. This is the story behind the making of Biohazard 3 Last Escape, aka Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Okay, so that was a snippet of Yasuhisa Kawamura's interview, and even though it was long, that was just a portion of it, so it's really interesting. I encourage you to read the whole thing. But you can see that Resident Evil 3, although initially intended to be a side story, doesn't have any less importance than Code Veronica. Now, when it comes to the story, this is the main reason why most people knock Resident Evil 3. They say, oh, the story isn't as good as the other Resident Evils. Now, I'll say right off the bat that if you're playing Resident Evil and you're a big fan of the series, storytelling probably isn't the number one thing that you're looking for when playing a video game, because although it's interesting, it is basic overall. Now, the story is certainly more fleshed out in Resident Evil 2, and there's a lot more going on with viruses and the like, and multiple plot points in the story and things like that for a lot of the other Resident Evil titles. But Resident Evil 3, the reason I like it as a story much more than other people give it credit for is that it's more focused. Sure, it's basic, it's about Jill being in Raccoon City as things are just getting chaotic, but that sense of focus really keeps me invested. You know, the goal is simple: get out of the city and you've got someone trying to kill you along the way. Yeah, it's not complex, but it does its job. You know, I don't need all sorts of other stuff going on in essentially a setting where zombies are all over the place and trying to eat you. You know, I'm not really asking for more in that scenario. But the reason why the story of Resident Evil 3 works so well, in my opinion, is that you're focused on one person, Jill Valentine, and you're really able to put yourself in her shoes. You're really able to grow with her and empathize with her struggle as the game goes on. You're right there with her, whereas Resident Evil 1 and 2, there's multiple characters, they're each going through their own thing. There's all this stuff going on with Barry and Wesker, and when really thinking about the plot, it becomes more, you know, B-grade sci-fi, whereas Resident Evil 3 is more grounded. It's dealing with the zombie apocalypse, but the goal is simple enough, and so I'm able to be set more in the moment. The game is not exactly a sequel as far as the storyline is concerned, but it is not a prequel either. It's actually a combination of the two, with the first half taking place before Resident Evil 2, and the second half taking place immediately after. Now, the story looks at Jill Valentine, the heroine from the original Resident Evil, and just as she prepares to leave Raccoon City, the T-Virus breaks out and causes zombies and mutated creatures to run all throughout the place and start eating people. And it doesn't help that the Umbrella Corporation, which caused the entire fiasco, has used it to transport their dangerous BOWs into the city to test combat data on their projects. Now, one such creature is the Nemesis, which had the game named after him. Now, he's been programmed to kill all STARS members, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service team, due to their knowledge of Umbrella's involvement in biological warfare. Fortunately for Jill, Umbrella has also transported mercenary teams to rescue civilians as a cover, along with also testing combat data on them too, and so she'll at least have some help in surviving this. That's basically the story, and it's not breaking any new ground as far as the story goes, but I don't understand why people really need that from this game. After all, most every Resident Evil game uses the same formula with slightly different twists. The gist of it is characters find themselves in a zombie outbreak, they use their wits to complete puzzles and dodge monsters, and with the help of a few other people, they manage to escape with a big explosion at the end. And that's not to say that nothing new is learned in terms of the story in this game. You actually do learn a lot about Umbrella's research into BOWs through files and interactions with other characters. And although it's not entirely new, it does expand upon the lore that Resident Evil 2 introduced. And because the scenario is more focused on what Jill is going through in the moment, it allows me as the gamer to become more emotionally invested in her and be present here in the now and really empathize with their struggles. You know, whereas Resident Evil 1 and 2, there's this side stuff with Wesker and Chief Irons and all that, and you're more concerned with what happened before you got there. And I think Resident Evil 3 gives you much more motivation to make it out alive, because the story is focused on you, the player, Jill's struggle, without much else getting in the way. Yeah, the story isn't complex, but I do love the cast of characters, and I think the characters here are actually really underrated. Not only do you have Jill, who is a really good character as far as the main Resident Evil ones are concerned, but the supporting characters are cool as well. I really like Carlos. He's kind of a joker. You know, he can make a wisecrack here and there, but he's really useful when it comes to helping you out. There were plenty of times throughout the game that I let him become the focus of a Nemesis attack, and he helps me down him. And from a story standpoint, he saves Jill. Without Carlos, there would be no Jill in the future. He's definitely no Steve Burnside, that's for sure. And the mercenaries that you meet are actually pretty cool. You kind of feel sorry for these guys because they didn't really know what they were getting into, and you are right with them in their struggle for survival. Mikhail's a really sympathetic character, although you don't see too much of him, but really, the highlight here is Nikolai Zinoviev, for me. He's nicknamed Silver Wolf if you look in the supplementary material, and I think Capcom can do a lot more with him in the future. He's a badass without having to inject himself with some kind of superpower virus like Wesker. He's not super cheesy like him. He's just a cold-blooded SOB who makes things difficult for you and pulls off the impossible, and his fate is left ambiguous, so I really hope to see this guy again. If you haven't played RE3, play it so you know what I'm talking about, because this guy's just cool. Even when it comes to non-playable characters who aren't part of the story significantly, you really feel for them. Like, oftentimes you'll run into people who are trying to escape the city and hear them getting caught by zombies and eaten, and there's no way for you to save them, and you just feel really bad. You know, these NPCs are just part of your struggle and part of what makes the story really effective despite its simplicity, because you feel helpless in those situations. You don't feel like the unstoppable badass. I always thought Resident Evil 3's scenario had a lot of charm, and much of that has to do with taking place in Raccoon City. Resident Evil 2 took place in a very small part of the city, but you were mostly in the police station and the underground laboratory, along with a short sewer section. Now, you do get to visit the Raccoon City Police Department in Resident Evil 3, but you are there for a very brief time period, maybe all of 5 minutes, 3 if you really know what you're doing. And as an aside, those who say, you know, a Resident Evil 3 remake could be done really quickly because they have all the police station assets, they should go back and play the game, because you're really not there that long. There's so much more to see. There are a ton of city streets, the police department, of course. You have a hospital, a clock tower, a park, an abandoned factory, a sewer area. There are a lot of places to go to. You have a power plant, gas station, a bar, diner. You're all over the place, and it really lets you see the full scope of the chaos. Seeing the destruction everywhere and all of the mangled bodies, it really helps with the immersion, and the graphics, fortunately, have been upgraded slightly from the first 2 Resident Evil games and Resident Evil 3. The FMVs and the backgrounds are less grainy. The FMVs themselves, the characters look a lot more realistic and human. If you go back and watch the FMVs, you can see how anorexic Leon and Claire look. They look like corpses. At least here, the FMVs, they look like real people. The improvement in the graphics is nice too, because there's also a larger variety of enemies, and their designs show some more detail than in previous installments. The blood's less pixelated, and the sound design, speaking of that, it's great. Every screen in Resident Evil tells a story about what happened there, and again, the graphics are really immersive. I'm of the opinion that pre-rendered graphics are superior to 3D graphics on the PlayStation just because of the technology at the time, and these are some of the best pre-rendered graphics that I've seen, with probably the exception of the Fear Effect games, but those are unsurpassed. Either way, the Raccoon City setting is just unparalleled in the series. Also helping with this are the sound effects and the sound design. They all sound similar to what you found in Resident Evil 2, but there seems to be a bigger variety of zombie noises, and the music, while not quite as memorable overall as Resident Evil 2's, it works in this sense, and a lot of times the music is absent, but when it does appear, it's really eerie and unsettling. And the voice acting, while not award-winning by any means, is a step up. It doesn't have that cheesy acting of Resident Evil 1, but it doesn't have that overly Canadian sound of Resident Evil 2, which is not to say Canadian voice actors are bad, but if it takes place in the US Midwest and people have Canadian accents, it's just kind of funny. The main reason why Resident Evil 3 is my favorite Resident Evil game has to do with its gameplay. And most of the changes from the prequels have to do with gameplay that got carried over to a lot of future titles. It really influenced the series from a gameplay standpoint. And in Resident Evil 2 Remake, they brought some of those introductions in Resident Evil 3 back to the series because they worked well. I find that Resident Evil 3 is the best balance of survival horror and action. It bridges the gap between fans of the slow, plodding nature of the first 2 Resident Evil games and the future 3D titles on consoles from the PS2 onwards. The first Resident Evil game was a lot of fun in terms of uncovering the mystery of the zombie outbreak, but its gameplay was on the slow and clunky side. I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school here. The difficulty was due more to the awkwardness of the controls as opposed to any need for strategy to defeat the enemies and the bosses. This is the same case with Resident Evil 2, where the gameplay advancements are barely noticeable. Aside from, graphics and story, they didn't really seem to improve much in terms of gameplay. Both RE1 and 2 required you to turn around slowly in place to face the other direction. Neither of them had an enemy lock-on feature in their initial releases, and there were no real means of self-defense once an enemy got too close to you. You just had to tank the attack and hope you had enough health to survive it. The only real strategy that I could find in the first 2 games was staying as far away from the enemy as possible and pumping enough ammo into it so it drops before it reaches you. And Resident Evil 2 even lowered the difficulty from Resident Evil 1, and is definitely the easiest Resident Evil game to date. If you've passed 2nd grade, you really have to try to get yourself killed in that game, or step away from the console while leaving it running in a room full of enemies. The combat is honestly really mundane in the early entries. But then the later games suffered from an opposite problem. At least as far as Resident Evil 4 goes, the enemies were too numerous, and success in combat primarily depended on how good you were at aiming at kneecaps or heads with your laser sight, so you could rush in for a melee attack right before you got swiped with a weapon or shot with an enemy's gun. Neither of these gameplay styles exactly thrilled me. RE1 and 2 were too slow and clunky for my taste, but the newer games were too action-focused, and decided to place its difficulty on throwing enemies at you in abundance. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, in comparison, hit that sweet spot where the gameplay offers you many different ways to dispatch enemies with your arsenal, but kept you vulnerable enough to where you really had to be careful. Enemies are much more agile this time around and can even follow you up and down stairs. As if this were not enough, you have swarms of zombies and other monsters regularly packing the environments. I think they doubled the amount of zombies that could show up on screen. Now, it's not really Resident Evil 4 levels. They don't pack it too much where you can't get out of a situation without getting hit, but it's definitely tougher than the first 2 games. Of course, the biggest and baddest new enemy is Nemesis, known in-game as the Pursuer. Once this guy shows up, the tension is increased tenfold, as he can follow you into different rooms and is much faster than you. He takes a large amount of ammo to drop, and if you manage to drop him, he gets up and attacks more aggressively before finally going down in that area alone. And it doesn't help that he can hit like a truck and bring you into danger status quickly. Once he gets you into caution, he can even one-shot kill you with a tentacle going through your head, increasing the tension even more. Although many of his appearances are scripted, there are a lot of random moments where you'll just open a door and he just comes charging after you. I recall one point where I just escaped from the top floor of a burned down newspaper office, and thinking I was safe began walking towards the direction of a large open street, when suddenly a shadow drops from the sky and Nemesis lands right in front of me, which startled me so much as a kid that I just shut off the game, even though I hadn't saved. Surprisingly enough, there are critics of the Nemesis, and they say, oh, he's not much different from things that were already done in Resident Evil 2. He's not different from Mr. X. I really have to disagree with the people who say this, and I don't think they're making a fair comparison, or they're really just simplifying how effective of an enemy Nemesis is. Nemesis really was the first one in Resident Evil who could follow you past one environment. The T-103, aka Mr. X in the original Resident Evil 2, he was not really a stalker in the game. He only showed up in scripted environments, and once you left that room, he could not follow you out of it. And he was really slow, he only walked. He didn't play an effective stalker. Now, he was from a storyline perspective, but from a gameplay standpoint, he was pathetic, so you really cannot compare him to Nemesis. It was an idea that wasn't even close to being realized in Resident Evil 2, and they just made that a reality in Resident Evil 3. I mean, there's a reason why Nemesis is to this day the most iconic Resident Evil monster. Zombies don't really count because zombies go across multiple games, multiple genres. Nemesis, being a unique Resident Evil monster, is probably the most iconic video game monster still. It shows you how effective he was at the time and how popular he continues to be. And it's not just Nemesis who's more difficult to deal with in this game. I mean, the enemies have much better agility. Sometimes they'll just rush at you at random. They can go up and down stairs freely. You've really gotta be on your toes for this one. And it means you do have to have that itchy trigger finger. It's not exactly as easy as it was to just back up as much as possible and start shooting. Especially once you get in a room with Nemesis after you, that strategy won't work on him. But with the large boost in enemy difficulty from the last Resident Evil games, Jill's abilities have fortunately been upgraded. A quick turn ability was fortunately added to RE3, which let you pivot 180 degrees in an instant. This means that you no longer have to walk in a slow circle in order to turn around. They've also added a dodge feature, and unlike future Resident Evil titles where dodging is activated with the QTE, here you don't get any indication. So you're not going to get a prompt saying, oh, press A right before the enemy hits you, and then 100% of the time you'll dodge it. So by pressing the weapon fire button right before being attacked, Jill will duck out of the way, and pressing a directional button with that will let you dodge in that particular direction. People have mentioned that it doesn't always work, which is true, but I like this because it's not a game breaker. You can be very good at dodging, and if you get the timing down right, I've seen people play it who end up not getting hit because they've mastered it, but like reality, even if you dodge something coming at you, you're not always gonna make it out of there. So I like that this is more skill and luck based. Along with the dodge, there's a unique emergency escape feature that was added to the game for situations where you are cornered and you don't have any ammo or just can't take another hit. It's pretty hard to pull off because you have to mash all the controller buttons simultaneously to activate it, and you have to get the timing done, but when it works you can shove groups of zombies out of the way and it could be a real lifesaver. I think I've done it more so on accident than on purpose most of the time, but when you do pull it off, it is really satisfying. And one of the great new additions is the ammo creation system. You could pick up a reloading tool and you could find different gunpowder around the city to mix and match them. You can either get freeze rounds, flame rounds, regular grenade rounds, shotgun shells, handgun bullets, and magnum rounds. So it's really fun just to stack up the gunpowder and mix and match and create different things. And I was really happy when they brought it back in Resident Evil 2. It was something that added a fair bit of strategy to the game. Going further into the subject of gameplay, people will notice that the game is only one disc, and as such there are no alternate scenarios like in RE1 or 2. Jill is the central focus in this. And you do have a brief run as a mercenary named Carlos, which I actually found to be one of the creepiest parts of the game while he's in the hospital by himself. I mean, even with him armed with an assault rifle, you really felt vulnerable. However, to make up for the lack of 2 separate scenarios, there is fortunately a live selection event that comes from time to time. Usually when Nemesis is on screen or when something happens in the environment, you have to make a choice where you get a few seconds to respond, and there's a temporary slow-mo where the screen will go black and white, and you could get to choose between 2 options or let it decide for you, usually at the consequence of damage. Now, your choice will affect the following scene and change both minor and major details of the story. I think that discovering the consequences for your choices adds a good bit of replay value, as well as trying to unlock all of the epilogues at the end. On top of this, there's a randomization of enemies and items that selects between, I believe, 3 or 4 predetermined options, so you won't always know what's going to be present when you get into a room. You won't know if you're going to find a certain type of ammo, or if a certain kind of enemy is going to be waiting there for you, or if anything's there at all. Sometimes there's not. So this sucks for speedrunners, but if you're someone who just likes to have fun and get some more replay value, this is a welcome feature that I hope they include in the remake. At the end of it, there is a minigame called Operation Mad Jackal. This is actually my favorite of the mercenaries, closely followed by the mercs in Resident Evil 5. But the reason I like Operation Mad Jackal so much is because there's kind of a story element to it. You can play as one of the 3 mercenaries that you find in the game, Carlos, Mikhail, or Nikolai. Basically, you have to reach a checkpoint where Chief Irons waits for you before the timer runs out, because the story goes you were implanted with the bomb, and the only way to get that bomb deactivated is by making it to Chief Irons so you can collect your cash and the disarmor. Now, you get more time by killing enemies and by pressing X on like hidden points in the environment, as well as stacking kills one after the other and rescuing civilians. That's actually the funnest point for me. You get to find people who are cornered screaming for help, and by clearing the room of enemies and talking to them, they'll give you a time bonus and either some more health or another weapon to help you reach the other side. And it really immersed me in the situation in terms of story, because you do know the mercenaries are in Raccoon City to save the civilians, and that's exactly what you're doing. I will concede that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis did not revolutionize the franchise, but it is the closest to perfect that Resident Evil ever became. The new gameplay features, increased enemy difficulty at the time, and especially Nemesis, combined with the scenario of taking place in Raccoon City during the T-Virus outbreak, you know, before all the Matrix and Wesker and Ouroboros, all that silly, stupid stuff, like that just combined together to make a really tense and thrilling game. It is the peak of Resident Evil when it comes to combining fear, tension, and action. Because of my love for this game, I am honestly more hyped for the Resident Evil 3 remake than any other game, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time playing that, much more than the Resident Evil 2 remake. So that's the gist of it. I really think Resident Evil 3 blends the best of the old school and the new school Resident Evil, and the gameplay improvements that it had over the first 2 games while still retaining that classic survival horror feeling just make it the best Resident Evil experience for me, and so far I think it's unparalleled in terms of Resident Evil games. I will say Resident Evil Remake came close because it carried over a lot of the same, Resident Evil 3 improvements, but Nemesis just has so much charm for me, and I think I prefer the setting of Raccoon City over the mansion. But it's close. I will defend my choice of Resident Evil 3 being the best Resident Evil game to the death, though. Or maybe not quite that far, but I'll argue with you heavily. So if you want to argue with me, comments on my video, or if you want to just agree with me and repeat my opinion back at me, I'm cool with that too. Alright, this is the Derek Wilder. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys later.